Thank you, David. It's a very special night here at the Library Mistakes because we're going to talk about the future. And usually we just talk about the past. We're going to talk about the future of economics, why it needs changed, and how we're going to change it. So this charity, for those of you who don't know, is involved in various different things. It began in 2004, 20 years ago, really, when we launched a course called The Practical History of Financial Markets, now known also as the Advanced Valuation in Financial Markets. And it teaches people about financial history and how you can learn from the past. Now, this is chipping away, actually, at the superstructure of economics / finance / investment. But you've got to start somewhere. So we've been chipping away for 20 years on the basis that there's more to finance than the Excel spreadsheet, a discounted cash flow, and the ferocious decimal point. This library, in some ways as well, tries to chip away at that superstructure of what economics / finance / investment has become, and has been doing so for 10 years. But it is very much chipping away at the superstructure. Anybody, certainly involved in the practice of investment, realizes that there is something more fundamentally wrong than a few bits and pieces bolted onto the superstructure. But there is something wrong at the foundations. And that's why Didasco has been delighted to support Patrick in his work, which is looking back to the foundations of economics / finance and investment. We have put over 1,500 students through this course, most of them professional investors, but have we changed much? Well, maybe we've changed something, but it certainly isn't very much. Now, Patrick goes to the foundations actually that were laid by others initially. Adam Smith, one thinks of, particularly in his theory of moral sentiments. Frank Knight and even Lord Keynes, all who saw a very different centre for economics, a centre that is very different, radically different from the man, and he is called the man, who has come to dominate the very centre and core of what economics is, the rational economic man. He wasn't always here. There used to be something else. Smith certainly didn't believe in him, nor did Knight. And nor did Keynes. And the beautiful thing about living in our modern age is there are breakthroughs that help us find out who this person, let's stop calling him a man, really is. Breakthroughs in neuroscience, breakthroughs in philosophy, and psychology that help us find what is the real driver rather than homo economicus. Because looking around the room tonight, I know three things about everybody in this room. One, you're not all rational. Two, you're not all driven by economic considerations alone. And three, you're not all men. But apart from that, homo economicus is a rather accurate core of what's going on here. So where did he come from, and how do we get rid of him? Well, I want to read you from Frank Knight, writing in 1925, who I think explains very well where this rational economic man came from. Surely the man who would undertake to treat human society merely as material for scientific manipulation, to control it by finding the laws of its responses to stimuli and devising stimuli to provoke the responses he might desire, would have to be classed as a monster or an imbecile. He might have abundant intelligence of the scientific sort, but would be lacking in sense. In other words, he was invented, this rational economic man, by somebody who wanted to control things. Somebody who thought if they could find this automaton to stimulate, then they could manage the economy. Not through observation, not through facts, but through a need to want to control. So we have this need for scientific manipulation, and I think that is where this monster came from. Whose monster? Marshall's monster? Samuelson's monster? Doesn't really matter. But in my lifetime, or in the last 20 years, the monster's had a few problems. Because like the Black Knight in Monty Python, his limbs are being hacked off. His limbs have been hacked off one by one by behavioral finance. He is no longer this rational being. There are a few predictable, apparently, and systemic behavioral biases. And one by one, the great Black Knight, that is the rational economic man, is losing his limbs. But for those who know Monty Python, you will know that the Black Knight is convinced that it is only a flesh wound. So perhaps tonight we are here to drive a sword through the heart of that rational economic man. Now, the MMH, the market mind hypothesis, is a new approach, fortunately pulling upon all this work that's already been done very recently in neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, and other disciplines. And just over a year ago, we held a symposium. Didasco helped fund a symposium which brought all these disciplines together. And very soon, Patrick and the MMH will be moving into the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which is a new and exciting part, a multidisciplinary part of the Edinburgh University, and that's where he should be, but not in the economics department, because perhaps even now this is just too blatant and too frightening for the economics profession. So, what is it that drives us if it's not the rational economic man? Well, let's ask Adam Smith, writing in 1759 in his Theory of Moral Sentiments. The man of system, on the contrary, is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislator might choose to impress upon it. I can't think of a definition more radically different from the rational economic man than every single piece has a principle of motion of its own. And now, thanks to breakthrough in modern science, we can begin to look to see what that principle of motion is. And that is what the market mind hypothesis is, and that's what its research is, to finally look and to finally get a better grasp of the principle of motion of us, of human society, that lies at the core of economics. If you're interested in joining us in the crusade against the Black Knight, then we welcome donations to this new pursuit at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, and you too can pick up a sword and finish him off. Patrick, over to you. Sorry.
It's green, David. Thank you, Russell, for that kind introduction. And welcome everybody to my talk, which will introduce the MMH in general, and my book, of which you see a screenshot behind me of the book cover in particular. In other words, what you hear this evening, you can read in more detail in my book. The aim of our research, which is undertaken by a growing group of collaborators, is to revamp economics indeed, no more, no less. Especially by improving our understanding of Mr. Market, which, as many of you know, is a moniker for the financial markets, specifically the collectivity of investors and especially their mentality. Interacting as they do with the real physical economy, which is a very important connection. Einstein once said, allegedly or not, that we need to make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I've taken that advice to apply to my talk, realizing that certain topics will remain difficult. There are different types of presentations, and I like to think of my talk metaphorically as taking you up the tallest tree in a very large forest. And the aim is to reach the top, or as high as possible, to give you an overview of everything that is of relevance to the MMH. And along the way, I'm taking you sometimes on a side route, along a branch, even along some of the very thin twigs, which may make you feel a bit uncomfortable because it's a bit wobbly, but it's important to have a specific look at specific areas of the forest or specific trees in order to get eventually that overall overview. And I promise I will always return to the main trunk of the tree. Regarding the book, the foreword was kindly contributed by Russell, the intermezzo by neuroscientist and complexity pioneer Scott Kelso, and the afterword by philosopher Julian Kuyferstein. On my last slide, I will share with you some further praise and recommendations of the book by interdisciplinary experts, many of whom were speaking, as Russell was saying, at our inaugural symposium in Panmure House last year. And Scott and Julian also spoke at that symposium. Due to time constraints, I can't cover all of our research. Specifically, the MMH submits the two-legged premise for the market-mind principle. Those two legs are mind as market and market as mind. And tonight I will focus on the second leg, market as mind. But it is important to realize that both legs are connected. In other words, there are a lot of similarities between markets and minds, and I'll show you some of those in one of my slides. In terms of terminology, when I talk about economics, please remember that it includes the nested discipline of finance and the nested practice of investment. The quotes you see here, I put them on early deliberately because I hope you have had some time to read them. They set the scene for my talk. I particularly point you to the bottom two, which I highlighted in blue. The first one is by Frank Knight, economist, almost a century ago, pointing out the blind spot in mainstream economics, namely the reality of consciousness in markets. And second, the flaw in mainstream economics, namely treating humans as mechanisms. And then below that, more recently, in a book that I identified here, actually in the Library of Mistakes, I think it's standing somewhere there, by D.J. Sornett, who concluded that the global behavior of the market is a reminiscence of the emergence of consciousness. Besides reflecting the topic of the MMH as a theory, they hint at the practical challenge. And this was nicely expressed by investment legend Howard Marks during my interview with him for his session of the inaugural symposium last year, when I asked him how cognitive science, what cognitive science should investigate that would be most beneficial to investors. And Howard immediately answered market mood. And I'll explain how market mood is related to consciousness and fits into the broader context of the MMH. Besides the earlier tree metaphor, these quotes also reflect part of my style of presenting as well as writing, whereby I use quotes to weave my story around. And there are two reasons for this. First, I subscribe to Michel de Montaigne's dictum, which is, I quote others in order to better express myself. In other words, why reinvent the wheel when you can give credit to those who already earlier beautifully worded the arguments you're trying to make? The second reason is that after 30 years in investment management, I like to think of myself as a pracademic. But I'm not an expert in all the fields that are relevant for the MMH. So I'd like you to hear it from the horse's mouth. And that's why I quote these various experts to help me make the case of the MMH. Let me start with the elevator pitch, and I'm only going to take you to the first floor, so to speak. The MMH is a so-called post-cognitivist interpretation of cognitive economics, which, as I'll explain later, is a partnering of cognitive science and economics. And the MMH attempts to formalize what investors have always casually referred to as the market mind. And in one of my later slides, I'll show you some screenshots of books where this reference is explicitly made. And that is the market mind, warts and all, and I'll come back to that as well. The MMH is based and informed by cognitive science, especially 4E cognition. And the 4E stand for, it views the mind as embodied, embedded, enactive, and extended. Those are the 4Es. And again, I come back to that in a moment. It leads overall to an improved understanding and hopefully also treatment of markets, as well as by extension the wider economic system. away especially from that flawed and outdated mechanical worldview on which mainstream economics is based. In turn, this will benefit society, and as many of you know, that was something that Adam Smith was very much concerned with. And this is why, in all modesty, we like to think of the MMH as our contribution to new economic enlightenment. So how did we get here that we're challenging this paradigm? Why are heterodox theories, not only the MMH, but also think of humanomics, which is promoted by Nobel laureate Vernon Smith and Deirdre McCloskey, but also narrative economics, promoted by Yale's Robert Shiller, or even the adaptive markets hypothesis, promoted by Andrew Lo at MIT. Why are they being developed? There are various reasons for it, but an important one is all the economic crisis that we've seen over the past decades. Perhaps starting with in 1987, Black Monday, where portfolio insurance and mechanistic investment strategies contributed to the crash. That was followed roughly a decade later by the collapse of LTCM, a hedge fund. Then we had, of course, the global financial crisis, the GFC. We had repo collapse just before the COVID crisis, and more recently, the UK's LDI crisis and various bank runs. They were all characterized by a dangerous tail wagging the dog, whereby the financial economy, consisting of markets and securities, and it is the psychological financial economy, was threatening the real physical economy, consisting of markets in goods and services. The GFC, of course, in particular, was not just systemic, but was existential. And the term financial Armageddon was used for a reason. Seth Klarman, founder of Baupost, an investment fund, called it in his 2009 investment letter, a life and death experience. In short, these crises raise so many questions and issues. Perhaps starting with the one asked on behalf of the public by the late Queen Elizabeth during her visit to the London School of Economics, where she asked this famous question: why did nobody see it coming? Now, we all appreciate, of course, the need for decorum during those events. But what she was actually asking, of course, was, why did nobody of you, the experts, see it coming? A few academics acknowledged this, and important for the MMH, there was the conclusion by Akerlof and Schiller that we will not understand important economic events unless we confront the fact that their causes are largely mental in nature. For them, this was a throwaway comment. But in cognitive science, mental causation is a very important and complex topic. Therefore, if we agree with Akerlof and Schiller's conclusion, and I think we should, then we need cognitive science to help us investigate this further. Larry Summers, as usual, was more blunt. Something is wrong with the economics profession if it doesn't change its thinking. And all of this is part of this economic soul search. More recently, Edinburgh's own Angus Deaton identified that there is a deep flaw in economics. And as I will explain, the MMH has identified this deep flaw as the blind spot of mainstream economics about the reality of consciousness in markets, and by extension, the mind-body problem. There were policymakers too participating in this soul search. Jerome Powell acknowledging that the linkages among monetary policy, asset prices, and the mood of financial markets are not fully understood. And then there was Trichet saying that the models were not very helpful. Finally, of course, importantly, the practitioners, those embodied in the market with skin in the game, who feel, in the words of Howard Marks, the market's temperature. So Soros emphasizing again, financial markets are not supposed to have moods, yet they do. And in his case, he was struggling with the inherent dualism in the economic system. As he worded it, the relationship between the mental mode of thinking and the actual physical state of affairs. In the literature, there are numerous quotes, usually of anonymous traders and investors, who talk about market mood and a sense of this mood. And the researchers for this quote, Knorr and Brugger, listed this under intersubjectivity with the market, which I will return to in a moment. First, what is our take on this? These crises should not be seen as independent incidents. The MMH argues that underlying these is a structural ongoing crisis caused by the wrong theory based on a flawed mechanical worldview, which creates, implements, and justifies policies, regulations, strategies, including investment strategies and other practices, which hurt markets and the conscious agents that inhabit them. In other words, economics is not an innocent bystander. So not only is there a blind spot, as identified by the late Queen, but there is also an elephant in the room, because it is not being addressed, and that is the reality of consciousness in markets. Instead, the man of system, as Russell already identified, and as Smith calls these central planners, have been doubling down on flawed thinking. On the neoclassical side, it is doubling down on the assumption of rationality. In behavioral economics, it is doubling down on identifying biases and heuristics, which is not very helpful. But also think here of systematic mechanized investment strategies, for example, which fall in the same trap, as my book explains. So in light of the need and wish to revise the paradigm, developing an alternative hypothesis seems opportune. And it's not just theories, but there are other initiatives along the same line underway, like the Institute for New Economic Thinking, co-founded by George Soros, but also a movement called Rethinking Economics, started by young scholars. And our research wants to contribute to this debate. So let's look a little bit more at mainstream's mechanical worldview. So the main flaw in mainstream economics, ignoring the reality of consciousness, originates in its mechanical or computational paradigm, also called worldview, which was revealingly captured by Robert Lucas, one of the founders of mainstream economics and especially the rational expectations hypothesis, when he stated, and I quote, "Economics is something that can be put on a computer and run. This is what I mean by the mechanics of economic development. The construction of a mechanistic artificial world populated by the interacting robots that economics typically studies. That is his economics. This is why we call it mechanical economics. And as I said, it also reaches into practices, as my book also discusses in detail. Now, there's a lot of criticism on this, and Joan Robertson, another economist who is critical of the rational expectations hypothesis, suspects there is a psychological complex here. And I quote her, "There is an irresistible attraction about the concept of equilibrium. With an almost silent hum of a perfectly running machine, the apparent stillness of the exact balance of counteracting pressures, the automatic smooth recovery of a chance disturbance. Is there perhaps something Freudian about it? The flaw is ontological. It is about the essence and nature of economic entities across all levels. Motivated by so-called physics envy, and George Soros, Philip Mirowski, Andrew Lowe have criticized this, mainstream's mechanical worldview, or what Knight calls mechanical monism, considers the economy to be a machine, the market an automaton, and their agents to be robots. And as you'll notice, none of them have consciousness. Instead, this worldview suggests we're dealing with mechanical entities that can be treated as such. Specifically, they can be controlled and engineered towards predetermined outcomes. So metaphorically, you pull a handle here, you push a button there, and you turn a knob in the middle, and the mechanical machine will work fine. Mixed with some Keynesian central planning, this obviously is very appealing to Smith's man of system, who after all subscribe to concentrated power and control, which includes not only many governments and their central banks, but also large corporations. How is this manifested? So I'm going to give you some examples, and I focus on the blue highlighted terms. So macro manifestations include central planning and social engineering. On the business side, there is corporatocracy and regulatory capture. And on the operation side, there is a growing automation. To the point, as Shoshana Zuboff of Harvard pointed out, there is surveillance capitalism. Then there are economic practices, many based on excessive or wrong mathiness. And that last term was introduced by Paul Romer, former economist of the World Bank. But Deirdre McCloskey and more recently Brian Arthur also criticized this. So think of quantitative analysis, developing and applying financial models, but also economic models like GSG models. Then there is financial monetary engineering, designing and using financial products, including derivatives, but also monetary policies like inflation targeting, yield curve control, and quantitative easing and tightening. And then, finally, importantly, systematic investing, mechanizing the full investment process, varying from passive investing to high-frequency trading to LDI and risk management practices based on value at risk. This reflects, all these reflect an overconfidence in and over-reliance on control and engineering. The problem is that mechanization begets mechanization. But if you want to address this or discuss this, you encounter a barrier with the man of system. And here I have paraphrased both Upton Sinclair and Charlie Munger, that it is difficult to get a man, in our case a man of system, to address a problem when he's incentivized to ignore it. There's also an overconfidence in, when we look at it in the framework of dual system thinking, for the analytical mind, or system 2, right? That logic and rationality to explain behavior. The problem here, as Smith already pointed out, is that our mentality includes internal sentiments as impression, in addition to external behavior as expression. And related to this is an overconfidence in analytical and computational tools. We don't have these tools for system 1, which could bring some balance in the dual system mind. As Geert Gerenzer and others have argued also, we need new tools and methods. So the problem is that this leads to automation bias. More generally, the problems start when this mechanical worldview is turned into those aforementioned practices that wield real-world influence. In other words, where perhaps initially innocent ivory tower thought experiments and simulations materialize into market machinations and manipulations, particularly of prices, but also market share. Think here of monopolies, buying up and otherwise eliminating disruptors to create and protect so-called moats, because that will protect the status quo, so we can do the same thing again and again. It leads to behavior that reduces diversification and increases imbalances in the collective market mind. It's reflected, for example, in crowded trades, moral hazard, a decrease in productivity growth, and a decline in new firm formations. In short, it is detrimental to free markets and, by extension, free market minds, again, at all levels. Talking about freedom, and just to clarify and to emphasize, the MMH is sympathetic to libertarianism. Think here the Austrian School of Economics. However, it doesn't need the politics of it. Instead, the MMH uses arguments from cognitive science to make the case of free minds. Let me close this slide by sharing a different quote from Frank Knight, who beautifully hits the point home, and I quote, "The power of mechanistic logic over common sense is great, but it does not extend to making the plain man deny that he and his fellows are conscious beings moved by conscious interests. Once more, one who denies the significance of consciousness is simply putting the abstract criteria of a logical system ahead of the fundamental, in this case psychophysical, principles which form the only foundation for that system itself." I mentioned the market mind, warts and all. Mr. Market is not perfect. But the imperfection can get worse. There's nothing mechanical, namely, about consciousness. Treating conscious entities mechanically is disastrous in general. Think here of brainwashing, of cults, of propaganda, etc. For markets in particular, it distorts and eventually removes price discovery. Think here of Jack Bogle's acknowledgement regarding passive investing. If it would become dominant, markets would collapse. He acknowledged this during a visit at the shareholder meeting of Berkshire Hathaway a number of years ago. Specifically, the rinse-repeat of if-then and similar algorithms embedded in the manifestations on the previous slide risk positive feedback loops. Here are examples of mechanically induced crises that turned in varying degrees systemic, and I've already mentioned most of them, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. Black Monday with portfolio insurance. Roughly 10 years later, LTCM with systematic leverage strategies. The bursting.com bubble with auto trading algorithms. Importantly, the GFC with the tail wagging the dog dynamic. The flash crash with high frequency trading, the repo crisis before the COVID crisis, and then more recently LDI and digital bank runs. To conclude this slide, economics as a theory, as I said, is not an innocent bystander, let alone objective observer like some other sciences are. It creates, justifies, and implements policies, regulations, strategies, and other practices based on its mechanical worldview, which subsequently mechanically impact the real and financial economies. This conflicts with the natural self-organizing principles of conscious minds, which is more akin to complexity by way of spontaneous exchanges aimed at discovery, especially of value. Many of the symptoms of our current economic predicament can be explained along these lines. For example, growing debt and growing inequality, which both simply reflect the mechanical, automatic repetitions that cause such growth. Rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. Think here also, again, of something that Einstein said, and I quote, "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over, but expecting different results." So we need to revamp economics, and a good place to go is cognitive economics, whereby the MMH is a particular interpretation. And in a moment, I'm going to take you to the second floor with my elevator pitch. Cognitive economics, and for this slide, I will shorten this as CE and compare it to BE, behavioral economics. CE is a partnering, as I said, of cognitive science and economics. And cognitive science itself is a multidisciplinary field that includes AI, neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, and sociology. And combined, it studies the mind in all its aspects, including consciousness and its collective dimension, which is of relevance here. For those hearing this with some skepticism and perhaps not familiar with developments along what I like to call that final frontier of mentality, consciousness, for the past 25 years, a consensus has emerged that, in the words of neuroscientists Giulio Tononi and Christoph Koch, means that, and I quote, "the study of consciousness is becoming a science," and that is within cognitive science. As I mentioned, the MMH is a post-cognitivist interpretation of CE, and post-cognitivism follows cognitivism and computationalism, which in turn followed Skinner's behaviorism. MMH is centered on a revision of our understanding of the human mind, from that of a mechanical brain-bound computer with some hard and software to that of a complex adaptive system that is embedded, enacted, extended, and embodied. So embodied, think for example of the famous back pains of George Soros that complemented whatever he was doing with the brain to make his trading successful. This is called, as I mentioned, 4E cognition that backs and informs the MMH. Briefly, a few words on the difference between BE and CE. Whereas BE focuses on the external, namely the expression of mentality via behavior, reflecting again its Skinner legacy, CE focuses on the internal, namely the impression of mentality, what it is like to undergo a mental state. Think, for example, of anger. When you're angry, internally, you're boiling inside. But externally, you express it differently, for example, via yelling, and both have different consequences. Second, in terms of dual process and dual system thinking, this is the thinking fast and thinking slow that is popularized by Daniel Kahneman. I'd like to make 2 points. In contrast to the BE consensus, CE does not demonize System 1 or S1, but it judges S1 and S2, so System 2, according to their particular benefits and shortcomings. In other words, CE gives credit and criticizes both Kahneman and Gigerenzer. Second point, consciousness plays the role of an overlay of System 3. That's how you should think about it. The technical reasons for this, which I explain in the book, I'm not going to go into it here, but I will try to make it more intuitive for you. How can you make the distinction between S1 and S2 in the first place? In other words, how can you subjectively, as an individual, know the difference between S1 and S2? Well, in a way, that's simple, right? Because they are experienced distinctively. Specifically, being emotional feels completely different than being rational. More broadly, the MMH states, and others have written about this, that this S3 complements this dual system thinking. And as I said, I'm going to take you to the second floor in a moment, but I told you that I'm going to show you some screenshots of books where there are specific references to the market mind. And most prominently, upper left there is the bestseller by George Soros, which he subtitled Reading the Mind of the Market. But technically, the MMH submits that the market, embodying numerous conscious humans and their technologies, intersubjectively extends investors' minds, whereby it not only distributes their knowledge in a Hayekian sense, but also manifests collective consciousness. And prices are the main informational signatures of this, while market mood is the immersive experience, phenomenally speaking, especially in real time, varying from, say, despair to exuberance. Let me explain a few terms here. On intersubjectivity, Yuval Harari in Sapiens states, the intersubjective is something that exists within the communication network, think here market, linking the subjective consciousness of many individuals. We can in turn link this to Frank Knight when he states, communication between consciousnesses is the fundamental fact of knowledge and the nearest we can ever get to an ultimate in human experience. The next thing to clarify is that this is about shared experience between subjects. In this case, while exchanging. I cannot trade with myself, neither can you. Therefore, in the anonymous financial markets, we all trade with Mr. Market, this collective entity. Another clarification, market mood is not market sentiment. Market sentiment is what investors try to capture analytically via bull-bear ratio, put-call spreads, or the VIX index. But mood is not and cannot be conveyed in a static way. It requires new research methods and tools inspired by cognitive science. And developing these is part of our research program. More broadly, let's be very clear what we're talking about here, namely extended consciousness. And our first cue comes from the seminal paper in 1998 by Andy Clark and David Chalmers, who opened their paper with the now famous question, where does the mind stop and the rest of the world begin? Which we can paraphrase for our purposes as, where does the investor's mind stop and the rest of the market begin? In other words, where's the cutoff? Michael Kirchhoff and Julian Kuyverstein hit the general point home, and I quote, the position we defend here is that the mind has no fixed boundary, the locus of conscious experience can smoothly shift from, on occasions being inside of the head of the individual, to on other occasions forming out of a nexus of interactions between brain, body, and environment, end quote. So it becomes intersubjective, coming back to that word, once the environment consists of or includes other conscious minds. In cognitive terms, markets show a supercharged and supersized version of what Clark and Chalmers called active externalism. For example, our collective state of believing is out there, namely in the constitution of prices, with securities acting as shared physical scaffolding, as I'll explain in the book. In the final analysis, we have to get to the conclusion that the notorious mind-body problem is extended into the wider economic system. For example, at the macro level, reflected in what I mentioned before, Akerlof and Schiller's mental causation, this tail wagging the dog between the psychological market and the physical real economy. Now, some of you may not be familiar with the mind-body problem, but it has confounded philosophers and scientists for centuries. It basically asks to explain the relationship between matter, i.e. the brain, and mind, i.e. conscious experience. Another way of stating this is how our physiology gives rise to our psychology, especially its qualities, known as phenomenality, transmitted via sentience. For example, your brain physically processing a 25% drawdown in your portfolio, which is all about quantity, is accompanied by the feeling of hurt, which is all about quality of that painful loss. So how is the quality of experiencing a drawdown related to the neurons that physically carry the signal? Consistent with physicalism, the efficient market hypothesis considers this as epiphenomenal and not relevant. However, if that is the case, then the hurt of pain from a losing trade is causally inert, which contrasts with the practical reality that it actually often leads to the physical action of closing that trade, irrespective whether this is rational or not. I'm going to share some similarities between markets and mind, because as I said at the beginning, they have a lot in common, and it is one of the main themes of the MMH. The general similarities were already recognized in economics, for example, by Hayek, and cognitive science by Kelso and Glimcher. And both fields have that shared final frontier of consciousness. And a quick definition is that consciousness is about dual realization, namely the physical production complemented by phenomenal consumption of information, and I'll get back to that in a moment. It starts with the ancient ideas of group and crowd minds in both Eastern and Western traditions, and I have many references and sources in the book. Evolutionary psychologist John Tooby and Leda Cosmides, in an important paper in 1994 in the American Economic Review, linked this to Adam Smith when they argued that, and I quote, "Natural selection's invisible hand created the structure of the human mind. And the interaction of these minds is what generates the invisible hand of economics." Coming back to that shared final frontier, in cognitive science, philosopher David Chalmers made a crucial observation that, the MMH submits, applies to both the individual and the collective extended mind, like the market mind. I quote Chalmers now. "When an experience realizes an information state, the same information state is realized in the experience's physical substrate. We might even suggest that this dual realization is the key to the fundamental connection between physical processes and conscious experience. We need some sort of construct to make the link, and information seems as good a construct as any. We might put this by suggesting as a basic principle that information in the actual world, think prices here, has two aspects, physical and phenomenal aspect." So here are a few specific similarities, which I'll run through fairly quickly. Like neurons, securities pass on information, especially via prices. They cluster by way of assets, industries, etc. And they are centrally housed in exchanges, just like neurons are in the brain and elsewhere in our body. Like our free mind, a free market mind can show spontaneous order. it doesn't need a central executive, in this case an auctioneer. In both cases, there's no homunculus. They can be Bayesian, testing hypotheses. Sometimes they're awake, at other times they're asleep. They both allocate resources, and they can both lose consciousness. In the market's case, Lehman almost caused a coma. So in conclusion, price discovery, involving the simulcasting of information from the market mind's cortical regions, leads to the market's awareness, phenomenally experienced by investors as mood. I thus didn't exaggerate when I mentioned the deep-seated connection between minds and markets. Investor consciousness extends when information is realized both physically and phenomenally in the market's mind via the concentrated numerical format of prices. In other words, prices form our construct, to use Chalmers' term. They are the informational building blocks acting as conductors to collectively bridge mind and matter in our efforts to benefit from and/or hedge against states of the world. Among others, this should change our view, not just of what prices are, but what they do. In turn, this has implications for how we investigate them and thus also for our policies and practices. Specifically, mechanical analysis methods do not capture mood. And we need to develop new research methods and tools, which leads me back to our research program. And these are the last two slides, which I will discuss quickly. The MMH research program, if all goes well, will be hosted by the Edinburgh Futures Institute and housed in that beautifully newly renovated building along Lauriston Place that I assume many of you have seen. Our program consists of 4 pillars: research projects, events, a book from which I will derive a course, and consulting. And among the events are guest lectures. And our inaugural guest lecture will be delivered in early December by the brilliant Deirdre McCloskey. For the events in December, we have a few places less over, so if you're interested, let Russell or David or myself know. And we created a research manifesto which includes descriptions of the planned projects, and it's included in Appendix 2 in my book. Here are a number of growing collaborators, which I credit hereby. Many of them were speaking at the inaugural symposium. And as you can see there, of those previous speakers, it's an eclectic bunch, interdisciplinary academics, but also investors and policymakers. I promised you also some further praise and recommendations for the book that you can see here, a selection of. The rest are in the beginning of the book. And I just want to conclude by emphasizing that the MMH is still under construction, and our program is like a startup, with my book as a guide. It is said by Arthur Schopenhauer and others that there are 3 phases in the acceptance of a new idea like the MMH. Roughly, at first, they ignore it, then they criticize it, and finally, they copy it and state it was obvious, and there I go along. I believe we're moving into phase 2 now. Expressed in terms of the movie The Matrix, we're basically offering you the red pill to wake up from that flawed mechanical worldview. I also started with the image of climbing a tall tree. Well, with our research, we also go deep down. So via our papers, my book, guest lectures, etc., we're showing you how deep the psychophysical rabbit hole of economics is, by exploring how minds and markets are related. This ultimately leads to the market-mind principle I mentioned. Intelligent, sometimes conscious self-organization via market dynamics, centered on exchange to discover values. This supports that reflexive two-way premise. Mind is market and market is mind. For more information, I refer you to some sources there. Thank you for your attention. Happy to answer questions, I guess, after the interview, right? Thank you. Sit here.
Patrick, I've been doing my job for 25 years, forecasting the markets. I've annoyed quite a few people, but I think you're going to beat me and annoy quite a few more than I have. So you ran us through at the end the system where we are. So what is the pushback? I mean, obviously we didn't arrive at this current view of economics without a lot of very clever people doing a lot of research. So what is it about the MMH that you get the pushback on, and what do you expect to get the pushback on? Because it is a really radical, different approach, coming from a different disciplines.
Yes. So if I can put the pushback and criticism in two categories. Perhaps surprisingly, there is the category or the group of parties that one way or another try to monopolize new economic thinking or new economic enlightenment or any of that. And the MMH is, if people realize it, is a very powerful theory. So it's considered as a threat. Now, the second category are the usual suspects. So that is mainstream economics, which we call mechanical economics, which basically is a partnering of the strange bedfellows of new classical economics and new Keynesian economics. And as some of you know, Milton Friedman was one of the founders there as well, and he argued that assumptions basically don't matter in terms of realism. And if you encounter them in the discussion, I like to explain this by quoting Robert Solow, who is a mainstream economist, but he was very critical of Robert Lucas and Thomas Sargent and basically new classical economics, because they don't want to discuss the assumptions, whereas Deirdre McCloskey and others have said the assumptions are crucial. And obviously, the assumptions that I argue that it's crucial. But here is Solow's famous Bonaparte anecdote, which I will quote. Suppose someone sits down where you are sitting right now and announces to me that he is Napoleon Bonaparte. The last thing I want to do with him is to get involved in a technical discussion of cavalry tactics at the Battle of Austerlitz. If I do that, I'm getting tacitly drawn into the game that he is Napoleon. If I do that, now Bob Lucas and Tom Sargent like nothing better than to get drawn into technical discussions, because then you have tacitly gone along with their fundamental assumptions. Their attention is attracted away from the basic, your attention is attracted away from the basic weakness of the whole story. Since I find that fundamental framework ludicrous, I respond by treating it as ludicrous. In his case, by laughing at it. So as not to fall into the trap of taking it seriously and passing on to matters of technique. And this quote actually is in a fantastic book by Arjo Klamer. He wrote this 40 years ago, Conversations with Economists, and I've said to Russell, it should be here in the library because it's a fantastic historic document of how people thought about those days and where we are now with our predicament. So that's my long-winded answer to your first question.
Well, fortunately, I'm not sitting here pretending to be Napoleon Bonaparte. We're here to discuss the research centre. We're here to discuss help going forward. But beyond the mere financial, intellectually, I think there's quite a few economists in the room. What is the contribution that people in this room or people watching can make in terms of the MMH?
Yeah, I mentioned a few collaborators already. I think, particularly if you read the book, there are very many topics that I suspect students, young scholars, but even senior academics are interested in. And in a way, almost, they need to be further developed as part of the MMH. And to some extent, perhaps people can create their own niche with it. So if you're interested in it, let me or my other collaborators know, perhaps draft a first paper, and in that way, we can develop the MMH together, and we can spread the words, etc. And there are enormous opportunities, I think, because the conviction, growing conviction that something in economics needs to change is there, and I think the MMH is a strong candidate to push this and to drive this.
Let's discuss reflexivity for those people in the audience who are in the financial markets. It's one of those few well-known theories of finance that contradict the efficient markets hypothesis, and I think generally accepted by many people from their observations every day, this theory of Soros' theory of reflexivity. Maybe explain what it is, explain how that might fit within MMH's confirmation or not of what MMH is about. I mean, you talked about it in general terms in Soros here, but more specifically, the theory of reflexivity and where it fits here and what it might mean.
Yeah, it's important to remember that Soros studied at the London School of Economics under Karl Popper. And Karl Popper wrote a paper on the mind-body problem. And Soros, many people don't know this, but his first post-graduation paper was not about investing, but it had the title, The Burden of Consciousness. And in everything, if you read carefully what Soros wrote, then reflexivity is in a way the economic early interpretation of this mind-matter interaction in the economic system. And as those of you who know a bit of, as investors on reflexivity, Soros specifically talks about prices impacting the fundamentals, whereas according to the mainstream theory, prices only should reflect fundamentals. And moreover, then you get into things like momentum, where prices impact prices. And so in other words, reflexivity was a very early but important insight from a smart investor on how mind-matter interaction works in the economic system.
One more question before we go to the floor. You've described Adam Smith as the father of cognitive economics. Do you want to explain more formally where this relationship is between where we are now and what Smith was writing about in the 18th century?
Yes, some of you may know that particularly by German intellectuals, a supposed problem was raised, and they called it das Adam Smith Problem, translated the Adam Smith problem, where supposedly there was a conflict between what he wrote in the Theory of Moral Sentiments and what he wrote in The Wealth of Nations. This has since already been debunked, but it's important to understand that the Theory of Moral Sentiments was an early exploration of cognitive science. And then the Wealth of Nations was an early exploration of economics. Therefore, Smith was the first cognitive economist.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure if he was around today, he'd be spending a lot of time with exactly the people you're trying to spending yes. time with here, to try and flesh out the theory of moral sentiments. I'm not sure the Wealth of Nations he would do much work to, but it was the very last thing he worked on was the theory of moral sentiments, so he knew there was work to be done. I know we've got lots of economists in the room, so I'm expecting lots of questions. So can we begin? Does anyone want to put their hand up with a question for Patrick? Right at the very back of the room. David, right beside you. Donnie?
Thanks. Where does technical analysis fit into this, Patrick?
Just a moment. I'm just connecting my...
Just hold it.
Shall I hold it?
Yeah,
okay.
just hold it.
Yes, so in my career, I did technical analysis. I'm a CMT as well. And
hold it a bit closer.
Closer?
Yeah.
So technical analysis is a method to capture, to a large extent, psychology, in particular, herd behavior. Eugene Fama, for example, acknowledged that momentum is the most stubborn and misunderstood anomaly in the markets, and momentum is part of technical analysis. So I think it is, together with some quantitative analysis and fundamental analysis, part of the toolbox for investors. However, it will not capture mood, and I hope I made that clear. We need new research methods and tools to capture this mood, this phenomenality in markets. And so technical analysis, as the word already says, is analysis, but we need something else. So whatever technical analysis tries to capture, I think it is more sentiment rather than mood.
David, we need you right down at the front. I think we've got a question right down here.
Thank you. You're talking quite a lot about markets in the context of trading. Trading is currently done by people, although increasingly by machines. My understanding of what you're saying about consciousness in this context is that there's something happens when people are in markets that generates a sort of third-party-ness around the collective consciousness, the kind of mind of the market. I wonder what your analysis is on what will happen when there are more AIs who are market operators, particularly in trading, and whether you would expect to see the same effect or whether that's predicated on something that's particularly human in your mind.
Yeah, I worry about that, and I write about it much more in the book, where, let's say, the awareness and the sense-making of humans is slowly crowded out, where even you can argue from a statistical point of view, whereas previously the prices were, as the term is called, human volume, is more and more mechanical volume of prices. And if prices, in a way, reflect our total mentality, so not only a conclusion of our analysis, but a conclusion of our sense-making, etc., if that is crowded out, we get to this complete automaton. And then you get, for example, what I said about Jack Bogle, if passive investing, which is one way of basically an algorithm, it's not only AI, but a fairly simple algorithm, is that slowly takes over, then I think the whole purpose of markets is at risk. So I'm concerned, and I explain it more in the book, but there are a number of aspects to this, including the statistical, right? I mean, the previous data contains different information, I think, than if it is increasingly just mechanical.
Stop investors using it on that basis?
Well, I think generally that there are a few problems with the economic system, and if mechanization begets mechanization, and it's not only in the financial markets but in the real economy too, then whatever we benefited from in real markets and in financial markets is, I think, at risk, because that this is what humanomics, etc., these type of heterodox theories also talk about, that it's almost being crowded out.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember that these prices are important. They're not just numbers dancing across the screen. They are signals for economic activity. They get involved in the allocation of resources. Those are our resources. So I think someone who doesn't follow financial markets might just think it's some great big game. But as we've discovered, and as the examples you've given, this has real-world consequences for all of us, and making the market mind mad, which maybe perhaps would be the result of that. A mad market mind means mad things for the real world.
Yes. And the only thing I want to add to that is many of the mechanized strategies via algorithms, etc., use what I call internal data, namely market data. So bid-ask, momentum prices, passive investing is just market cap. There's no translation to the data in the real economy, right? And that is the external data. So CTA, trading strategies, passive investing, high-frequency trading, all of that is internal data. So the link is completely, that's why, to some extent, I think it explains why financial markets can run away from the real fundamentals. And ultimately, this comes, again, back to this mind matter, right? Where is our awareness and sense-making for the economics, and where is it crowded out?
So there's a question somewhere at the back. Yep.
Yeah, I do have a question. I'm just going to, first of all, just comment on the point around using AI and algos. Having traded algorithms in the past and done pretty well at it, I can tell you that it's very difficult to not interfere and turn them off when it's either losing too much money or making too much money. So maybe the MMH still applies, even if you've got an AI bot running. When your own money's on the line, you still want to interfere with it. But my question, I guess, for you is, how much do you think we have to lay the blame of introducing mathematics into economics in terms of trying to turn it into a pseudo-physics? Is that something, and I think removing maths from it, is that part of cutting one of the limbs off the Black Knight?
The two main points I want to make. First, and this is why I work with Scott Kelso and Carl Friston, etc. If you, to some extent, accept that there is this mind working in the markets, then you need to use different math. So math is fine, but it's the wrong math, they say. And Gergi Gorenzo has said this also. The second point is that if you look at the history of how mainstream economics evolved and emerged, I argue in the book that the cart was put before the horse. So the theory had to fit this deep desire to model and to put everything into mathematics. So the theory followed, let alone the empirics. And I mean, to me, it was stunning that Robert Lucas, just before the global financial crisis, said that we've solved all the depressions, etc. Right? I mean, even afterwards, in some of the autobiographies of central bankers, there's still the denial that these are empirical facts, these events that tell you something. And part of the problem is mathematics, but not totally. We just need to adjust mathematics.
Yeah, I mentioned in the introduction that when you're a practitioner and you want to know about market psychology or crowd psychology, people say, well, go and read Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, written in the 1840s. And then they say, well, you can graduate that from Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd, written in the 1890s. And if you really want to get up to date, there's, is it Canetti, The Crowd and Power, written in the 1960s. It's quite remarkable, given how much we are in a crowd and feel in a crowd, just how little time we spend properly looking at it. I tried to hire 2 people as guest lecturers for the course that this charity runs on crowd psychology. Asked the first one, would he come and give us a lecture on crowd psychology? He said he felt uncomfortable talking to people in finance because he had studied the crowd psychology of football hooligans. And I said, well, you might find out that there's actually quite a lot in common there. And the second one said he felt uncomfortable because he'd studied the crowd psychology of the police. So inherently, this is crowd psychology, and yet we spend so little time trying to understand it. Do you think that's a legacy of the mathematization of finance / investment / economics? We know it's there, and yet we spend so little time looking at it. Is it we just think we can't possibly understand it?
Yeah, I think that is a large part of it. And as I said before, in fairness, if you want to go beyond the sentiment, so yes, you can code your indicators to get to this sentiment thing, but to capture what I think is the most important is this mood thing. In the sense, we need different tools, and the type of math that is used in economics now or in finance is not applicable to that more interaction, that dynamic stuff. And just to give a hint, right? I mean, Victor Niederhofer, who you also know, he blew himself up, financially speaking, 3 times. But apart from that, he did something very remarkable. And in order to capture the dynamics within all these markets, he created very early on a computer sounds to complement whatever he was doing analytically in Excel spreadsheets, etc. So to use a different sense in addition to looking, etc. These are the type of tools, totally different way of getting to grips with this crowd, this mood thing, this overlay, where the crowd mood can even swamp your own mood. You can be bullish, but if the market goes down, that mood totally takes over. And so, again, long-winded answer.
Well, Niederhofer was slightly different. He's got one chapter in his book is music and speculation, and the second one is sex and speculation. So a bit different from the average book on finance.
Yeah, we should get him as a guest speaker here.
I don't think he's around anymore.
Yeah.
No, he isn't.
Yes.
Okay.
But
Okay. Any final question for Patrick? There is one right down the front, David, as usual.
If the market is the global consciousness for economics and resource allocation, are there other global consciousnesses for other aspects of human life? And small follow-up, are you running away from physics envy and accidentally stumbling into biology envy instead?
Yes. On the second question, I follow the lead of some cognitive scientist, whereas there was the naturalizing the mind previously, there is now the biological or organic turn, as it's called, where the realization is that there's something special about biological entities and consciousness. So I may, but I'm following the lead of others, so then others are. And on the first question, I discussed it in the book. So, for example, the internet or Wikipedia or whatever, the internet could be an example of. And Christoph Koch, who is one of the neuroscientists who is promoting integrated information theory as a theory on consciousness, strangely says that group consciousness cannot exist, but he does recognize internet as kind of a group awareness. The difference is, and I explain this in the book much more, is that in the markets, the importance of surviving, where we're living in the economic jungle. We move from nature's jungle to the economic. This idea of existence, existentialism, etc., surviving, is much more prominent in markets than in the internet. And therefore, I would make the case that the consciousness in markets is much more pronounced and more important.
Thank you. So we're looking for volunteers, as you can tell, to take this forward. So whatever form of volunteering you want to do, just email me at keeper@libraryofmistakes.com. We are here to change the world one mistake at a time. That is our mission statement. This would be a big one. And if you'd like to help, please get in touch. That's the Market Mind hypothesis. Patrick, thank you very much.
Thank you.